In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the cell membrane. We've already learned that the cell membrane is an organelle. Take a look at this animal cell here. This is a eukaryotic cell. We know it's an animal cell because we can see the shape of it, and we also know it's eukaryotic because I see the nucleus right here. If we take a small section out of the cell membrane here and we enlarge it, this is what it looks like. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about this structure here and all of the pieces that make up this structure and why those pieces are important. So let's get started. All living things that have cells, whether they are prokaryotic or eukaryotic, have a cell membrane. There are three other names for the cell membrane. The first is the plasma membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, the fluid mosaic model, and no matter what name we use, they all mean the same thing. They are all still just the cell membrane. So let's fill in. So the first one is the plasma membrane. The second one is the phospholipid bilayer. And the third one, fluid mosaic model. Okay, this one here, the fluid mosaic model. Fluid means movement, and mosaic is a bunch of different little pieces put together to make up a larger piece. And that's exactly what the cell membrane is. It's a bunch of little pieces put together that are very fluid, which allows the cell membrane to work really well inside living organisms. This here is a picture of the cell, okay, and this is the outside here. And we're going to talk about this lipid bilayer, okay? Inside the cell is mostly water, and outside is water, mostly water too. So the cell membrane is an organelle, and we learned that organelles have jobs in the cell. The main function or job of the cell membrane is to maintain homeostasis, which is a balance. And it does this by controlling what enters and exits to the cell. So on this line here, we're going to want to type in or write in homeostasis, which is a balance. And if I spell things wrong, homeostasis, okay. So what might the cell want to go in? Well, the cell might want food, water, oxygen. These are things that could be going into the cell that the cell may need. What might the cell want to go out? Well, things that the cell may not want any longer are wastes, water, carbon dioxide, put a little 2 there, okay. So to maintain this balance, the cell needs to be able to take things in, and it needs to allow things to go out. So we can compare a cell membrane to a window screen. What would we want to go through our window screen? Well, we probably would just want some air, right? I can't think of anything else we would want to come in through our window screen. What are things that we want to keep out? Well, probably people, right? We wouldn't want people coming through our screens. Bugs, leaves, birds, animals. Okay? So just like our cell membrane wants things in, it also doesn't want certain things out, and it needs things to go out. So on our window screen, we want air in, and we want to keep other things out. That's why the cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane. We can also call it a selectively permeable membrane. Okay, permeable membrane means permeable means anything can go in. But the cell has a semi-permeable membrane, which means only certain things can pass through. The cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane. We don't want dangerous things like waste to enter another cell, and we also don't want important things like food to leave. So that's why the cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane. We can also call this selectively permeable. Selectively permeable. Okay. Okay, you've come to your first stop and jot question. Pause the video, fill in your answers, and call one of your teachers over to check your answer. Let's talk about the cell membrane structure. What makes up the cell membrane? There are three parts to the cell membrane. We have lipids, which we call phospholipids, proteins, and cholesterol, which is also a type of lipid. So there are two types of lipids, the phospholipids and the cholesterol, and there are proteins. So let's fill in. We have lipids, we have cholesterol, and we have proteins. Those are the three parts to the cell membrane. Phospholipids make up most of the cell membrane. So what do they look like? What does a phospholipid look like? Well, it has two parts. The phospholipid is made up of two parts. Phospholipid. It's made up of two parts, the head and the tail. Okay. This is a phospholipid here. This is the head, and these are the tails. Kind of looks like a little man. Okay, so let's break down the phospholipid part. The head is made up of a phosphate molecule. That's why we say that's why we call it a phospholipid. The head is a polar molecule. A polar molecule has charges. That means it likes to stick to things. Like when you charge up a balloon and rub it on your hair, it will stick to a wall. So water is also polar. It has charges. The head and the water like each other. Okay? The head is hydrophilic, which means it is water loving. The head and water have opposite charges, and opposite charges like to stick together. Remember, opposites attract. So the head is made up of a phosphate, and it is water loving, which we call hydrophilic. The tail is a non-polar molecule. It doesn't like to stick to things like water. It actually repels water. So we say that it is hydrophobic. And the reason it repels water is because it's made up of lipids. And we learned that lipids are fats. Okay? Lipids repel water. The tails have a fear of water. Hydrophobic means water-fearing. So right now, you're going to label the following parts of our phospholipid. Okay? You're going to label polar, nonpolar, hydrophobic, hydrophilic, head and tail. Use this part up here to label your phospholipid. Pause the video now and go ahead and do that. Call your teacher over to check when you're through. Okay, so phospholipids are arranged in 2 layers. That's why we say that another name for the cell membrane is the phospholipid bilayer. So if this part is inside the cell, okay, this is inside the cell, this is outside. You see the heads here on the inside. There are also heads on the outside of other little guys, and then the tails all make up this lipid layer on the inside. The head face the water on the inside and on the outside, and the lipids are on the inside where they don't touch the water. They keep the water inside the cell, and they keep the water from rushing into the cell. It creates a barrier. So another name for the cell membrane is the phospholipid bilayer. Phospholipid bilayer. And just remember, inside and outside of the cell is water. The phospholipid heads face the inside and outside of the cell because there's a lot of water there. The tails are facing each other on the inside because they do not want to get near the water. The heads face the inside and outside of the cell because there's a lot of water there, and the tails face each other because they don't want to get near the water. Okay, here's another picture. So you can see the heads here and on the inside of the cell. This is the inside of the cell. This is the outside. So you have your hydrophilic heads here, hydrophobic tails here, and then another layer of hydrophilic heads here. So this whole layer here, the whole layer is called a phospholipid bilayer. We say bi because bi means two layer. Here's another picture. This is another cross section. We just enlarged. We took a segment here, stretched it out and enlarged it. These are the heads. They love water. They're hydrophilic. The tails are on the inside of the phospholipid bilayer. The tails repel water. They are hydrophobic. They fear water. And again, the heads here, heads love water. They touch the water. They're hydrophilic. Okay, you've come to another Stop and Jock question. Pause the video, answer the question, and call your teacher over to check. Okay, let's talk about proteins on our cell membrane. The phospholipid bilayer is also made up of proteins. There are 3 types of proteins, and they have different functions. Some are used to transport or move big things like carbohydrates and proteins into or out of the cell if they can't get through easily. Some are for communication. Cells need to communicate with each other to make sure they're doing things properly, that they're doing their jobs right. And cells finally need to identify each other. Cells need to be able to know which cells are good for the body and which are bad for the body, especially when we're looking at cells that are part of the immune system. So take a look here. This is the outside of the cell, so this is the inside down here. We see our water-loving heads. Our tails are on the inside here. They hate water. They're water-fearing. They're hydrophobic. And then we see these other molecules here. These are proteins, okay? Protein molecules here. Okay? The phospholipid bilayer then is made up of proteins. There are 3 types of proteins with different jobs or functions. There are proteins for transport. Okay. If there's a large molecule, a carbohydrate molecule that needs to get in, it'll head right in through the protein channel. Okay. There are proteins for communication, to make sure other cells are doing their jobs right, and proteins for identification. Is that a good cell or a bad cell? All right, and let's move on to cholesterol. So again, here's a little cross section of a phospholipid bilayer. We have the water-loving heads here, are phosphates. They're hydrophilic. Our tails, they're hydrophobic, and they make up the phospholipid bilayer center, and then again our heads here. But these little pieces we haven't seen before, right? These honeycomb shapes are the cholesterol. Cholesterol looks a lot like honeycombs. They help maintain fluidity. So these cholesterols in here help maintain fluidity. The purpose of the cholesterol is to help maintain fluidity of the membrane. So fluidity, what is it? It sounds like the word fluid. Fluid flows and can change shape and can interact with its environment to change its shape. We want our cell membrane to do the same thing. We want our cell membrane to be able to change shape and to be able to interact with the environment in order to change its shape. We don't want our cell membrane to always be the exact same shape. We don't want it not to be able to bend. We want it to be able to bend. Or we don't want it to be manipulated by things going on around it. If that were to happen, our cells would crack. If the cell couldn't bend or if something bumped into it and broke it, the cell would crack. If our cells cracked, all the stuff inside of our cells that is vitally important to metabolism and homeostasis would not work and our cells would die. If the cell membrane was just a solid, nothing would be able to go across the membrane. Nothing could go in, nothing could go out. But by being fluid, the things can get across the membrane. Fluidity is an important characteristic. Cholesterol maintains that fluidity. Cholesterol is easy to identify because it looks like honeycomb. So here's your phospholipid bilayer. We can identify the honeycomb here, and that's our cholesterol. The honeycomb shape indicates that there's cholesterol here, and it helps maintain fluidity. Just look for the honeycomb shapes. So you can color in, when you get a chance, the honeycomb shape here and label it cholesterol. Okay, you've reached your last Stop and Drop question. Pause the video, answer your questions.